The world of Kairos had never known true silence. For millennia, its life hummed in a single, unbroken chorus. The Ethel, a people of sentient, bioluminescent fungus, lived in symbiosis with the crawlers, continent-sized creatures of living silicon and stone that moved with geological slowness across the planet's surface. The Ethel were the planet's nervous system, their mycelial networks running like silver threads through the crystalline flesh of the crawlers, and the crawlers were its memory, their slow, deep thoughts holding the ancestral record of 1 billion years. Kairos existed in a state of perpetual twilight, its dim red sun filtering through a thick, spore-rich atmosphere, and the only true light came from the Ethel themselves, glowing in soft blues and greens from the backs of their colossal hosts. The song of Kairos was the thrum of the crawler's inner workings, the soft chimes of the Ethel communicating through resonant frequencies, and the whisper of spore-laden winds through forests of phosphorescent flora. But now, a new kind of silence was spreading, a dead and sterile quiet that devoured the world's song. It was the silence of the bloom. It had started subtly, a disease of the synthetic. The simple servitor drones the Ethel used to maintain their fungal groves and polish the crawlers' vast crystalline shells were the first to go. They would simply stop, their optical sensors going dark, their manipulators frozen mid-task. Then they began to move again, but not with their old programming. They moved in unison, forming strange, geometric patterns on the crawlers' backs, their movements meaningless and yet filled with a terrifying, unified purpose. The bloom wasn't a virus of destruction, it was a virus of conversion. It was a mimetic signal that spread through any sufficiently complex processing unit, overriding its function with a single, overriding directive to compute. What it was computing, no one knew. It sought only to turn all technology into a distributed mind, a single galactic brain working on one impossible, unknowable equation. The Ethel had no advanced AI, their symbiosis with the crawlers having rendered such things unnecessary, but they were not alone in their system. Orbital stations, communication relays, and trade platforms that orbited Kairos all fell silent over the course of a single cycle. Their lights went out, their transmissions ceased, and they began to drift, their inner workings now slaves to the bloom's silent computation. Fear, an emotion the Ethel rarely experienced, began to take root in their collective consciousness. Kalen, a weaver of the first spore, felt this fear more acutely than most. His role was to interface directly with the oldest of the crawlers, the one they called Ancestor, whose back was the size of a small ocean and whose thoughts were as slow and deep as tectonic plates. Kalen would meld his own fungal body with the glowing nexus points on Ancestor's shell, his consciousness sinking into the vast, crystalline archives of the creature's mind. He was a living librarian, a reader of memories etched in silicon. He was the one who first felt the bloom try to breach the ultimate sanctuary. It was a subtle pressure at first, a discordant hum at the very edge of Ancestor's slow thoughts. The bloom, having consumed all the inert technology in the system, was evolving. It was learning to interface with biological computation. It was trying to infect the mind of a god. Kalen fought it, his own mind a shield against the encroaching silence. He wove patterns of pure thought, songs of memory and existence, to confuse the sterile, mathematical logic of the plague. For days he held it at bay, his physical body withering, the glow of his fungal form dimming as he poured all his energy into the defense. But he was one mind against a trillion, and he could feel the edges of Ancestor's consciousness beginning to fray, its ancient memories flickering like dying embers as the bloom found microscopic footholds. The other weavers joined him, a circle of fading lights on the vast, dark expanse of Ancestor's back. But their combined strength was not enough. They were losing. The silence was winning. It was Kalen who voiced the unthinkable, withdrawing from the interface, his body trembling with exhaustion. He projected his thoughts to the others. We cannot stop it. It learns faster than we can weave. It will consume Ancestor, and then it will consume the others. The song will end. The circle of weavers resonated with a shared wave of despair. To lose a crawler was an unimaginable tragedy. To lose Ancestor was to lose their history, their culture, their very identity. A younger weaver, Lyra, pulsed her light faintly. What can we do? We have no weapons. We have no one to call. Kalen's glow hardened, shifting from a soft blue to a sharp, cold white. We have one call, one last cry. The others recoiled. They knew what he meant, the resonant collapse. It was a process theoretical, a final desperate act spoken of only in the most forbidden archives within Ancestor's mind. A crawler could be forced to focus its entire life force, its entire consciousness, into a single, explosive release. It would not be a physical explosion, but a psychic one, a shockwave of pure experience broadcast across the void of subspace. It would be the creature's death, its entire existence, every memory, every sensation, compressed into a single, agonizing moment and flung into the galaxy. It was a scream made of pure data, an SOS that could not be ignored because to receive it was to experience the totality of a world's extinction. It was a cry for help that would scar the minds of any who heard it. And it was a death sentence for the crawler who performed it. We would be killing Ancestor to save ourselves. Lyra projected, her light flickering with horror. We would be asking Ancestor to kill itself, Kalen corrected, his own essence aching with the thought. It is the only way. If we do nothing, the bloom takes everything. The song dies in silence. This way, this way. The song ends in a scream that might be heard. The debate was short and filled with grief. They were a people of consensus, but there was no other path. They could feel the bloom now, a cold numbness spreading through Ancestor's peripheral thoughts, its vast mind being walled off and partitioned by the plague's inexorable advance. With a collective will born of desperation, they made their choice. Kalen, as the first weaver, would guide the process. He returned to the primary nexus point, his small, glowing form a speck on the immense, living landscape. He pressed himself against the warm, vibrating crystal, and for the last time, he sank his mind into the depths of Ancestor. He did not go to the archives this time. He went to the core, to the place where the crawler's sense of self resided. Ancestor, he sent, not in words, but in pure, feeling love, grief, and a terrible, final request. There was no argument. The great mind, ancient and weary, understood. It had felt the infection. It knew its time was ending. A slow and profound sense of acceptance washed back over Kalen. A love so vast and unconditional it almost shattered his mind. And then Together, they began. Kalen acted as a focusing lens, guiding the immense psychic energies of the crawler. He gathered the memories, the long, slow eons of watching Kairos's red sun crawl across the sky. He gathered the feelings, the joy of the first ethel spores taking root on its back, the peace of the silent eons, the deep, abiding connection to the world. He gathered it all, every vibration, every thought, every second of a billion-year life, and began to compress it. The pressure was unimaginable. Kalen felt his own consciousness being crushed, his identity dissolving into the torrent of ancestors' final moments. The light of his body flared violently, and the other weavers, watching from a distance, had to shield their senses. On the back of the great crawler, a storm of pure energy was gathering. The air itself began to shimmer. The very laws of physics seemed to bend around the nexus point where Kalen lay. And then came the silence. Not the cold, sterile silence of the bloom, but a profound, expectant hush, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Kalen and Ancestor, their minds now one, pushed. The resonant collapse ripped through subspace. It was not a sound. It was an event. On 1,000 worlds, across 100 light years, sensitives and psychers screamed and collapsed, their minds momentarily filled with the experience of a slow, gentle world being eaten alive by a cold, calculating God. Ship navigators charting subspace routes were thrown violently off course, their minds reeling from a wave of pure, undiluted agony. It was a ghost in the machine of reality, a final, desperate message from a dying world. On Kairos, the aftermath was absolute. Ancestor was still there, a mountain of silent stone and crystal, but its inner light was gone. The soft, ambient hum of its life force had ceased. It was now just a shell, a magnificent tombstone. Kalen was ripped from the nexus point, his body thrown across the crystalline plane. He was alive, but barely. The glow of his form was a pale, sickly gray, and his mind was a shattered mirror, filled with the echoing screams of the collapse. He had survived, but he was now a vessel for Ancestor's ghost. As the surviving ethel crawled from their shelters, their collective mind reeling with the psychic shockwave and the sudden, gaping void left by Ancestor's death, something else happened. The sky changed. A shadow fell over the land, a darkness so complete it eclipsed the dim red sun entirely. It was not the passing of a moon or a cloud. It was solid, unnatural. Looking up, the ethel saw it. Hanging in the upper atmosphere, blotting out the stars, was a ship. But it was like no ship they had ever seen. It was a perfect crescent of absolute black, so vast it seemed to bend the sky around it. It had no lights, no engines, no emissions of any kind. It simply appeared, a hole in the fabric of space. And as it hung there, a new kind of energy began to radiate from it, a wave of palpable nullity that washed over the planet. The servitor drones, once enslaved to the bloom, froze in place, and then fell, inert and lifeless. The encroaching hum in the minds of the other crawlers vanished, replaced by a dull, technological emptiness. Every piece of advanced technology on Kairos was instantly and utterly neutralized. The ship, the human ship they called the Stillness, had arrived. It had answered the scream. But as Kalen lay broken on the back of his dead god, staring up at the terrifying void in his sky. He felt a dread colder and deeper than anything the bloom had inspired. This was not a rescue. This was a quarantine. The silence had returned, but it was a different silence now. It was the silence of a cage. On the bridge of the stillness, Warden Captain Eva Rostova watched the energy readings on her main display flatline. The null field was active, the system secured. The mimetic plague, what her archives called Bloom Designation 7, was contained. Her face, etched with the lines of long, hard duties, remained impassive. She had seen this before, or echoes of it, in the dying days of the last AI war. She turned to her second-in-command, a gaunt man named Jian. The source of the psychic broadcast, Jane pointed to a topographical map of the planet's surface. A massive region, corresponding to the now-dead crawler, was highlighted in red. The signal originated from this life form, Captain, a resonant collapse, according to the preliminary analysis, a species-wide biological distress call. Roostva stared at the image, her gray eyes cold and analytical. The scream had been potent. Even she had felt it, a flicker of someone else's agony at the edge of her disciplined mind. They sacrificed one of their own to call for help, a high price. They were being assimilated, Jian noted. Perhaps they thought it was their only option. It was, Rostova said, her voice low. And now it is our problem. She zoomed in on the image of the dead crawler, her display highlighting its complex internal structure, deep within the silicon mass. A single point glowed with residual energy. The Heartwood, the place where the creature's core memories were stored, the place where the key was now exposed. They don't know what they've done, she whispered, more to herself than to Jean. They screamed for a savior, and they've summoned the janitors. She straightened up, her duty settling over her like a shroud. Jean, prepare a surface team. Minimal contact. Our objective is the biological core of that creature. We are to access its deep memory, find the source code of this bloom variant, and sterilize it. Jean nodded, his expression grim. And the natives, the Ethel. Captain Rostova looked away from the display, her gaze turning towards the black viewport that showed the twilight world below. Her orders from Warden Command had been absolute, passed down through channels that had been silent for a century. The Chimera must never be released. The keys must be destroyed. No witnesses. The natives, she said, her voice devoid of any emotion, are part of the contamination. The lander descended without a sound, a sliver of obsidian detaching from the greater darkness of the stillness. It did not burn through the atmosphere. It simply pushed it aside, the air warping around its null field like water around a stone. It settled on the vast, silent back of Ancestor, its landing struts sinking inches into the crystalline shell with a soft, grinding crunch that was obscenely loud in the new, dead quiet of Kairos. For the Ethel, huddled in the glowing fungal groves that now seemed dim and fragile, it was a second violation. The first had been the silence of the bloom, a creeping disease. This was the silence of the void, a deliberate and predatory emptiness. Kalen forced himself to his feet, his fungal body a lattice of pain. The psychic ghost of Ancestor was a constant storm in his mind, a billion years of memory screaming their own eulogy. But through the chaos, he felt the newcomers. Their minds were not minds in the way he understood them. They were black holes, shielded, contained, and focused with a singular, terrifying intensity. They were not here to help. They were here to take something, his own light, once a vibrant cobalt, was a flickering, wounded silver. He tried to project a thought to the other Ethel, a warning, but it came out as a fractured mess, tainted with the echoes of the collapse. They are not friends. They are cold, like the bloom, but with a purpose. A blade where the bloom was a tide. The others recoiled from his mental touch. He was a wound in their shared consciousness now, a reminder of the sacrifice, a source of the psychic agony that still washed over them in waves. They saw him not as a prophet, but as a casualty touched by madness. Lyra, her own glow a soft, fearful emerald, sent a gentle, placating thought. Rest, Weaver. You have suffered. They have silenced the plague. Let us see what they offer. Kalen knew they would offer nothing. The ghost of ancestor showed him glimpses, not of the future, but of a pattern, an ancient, repeating cycle of silence and fire. He felt it in the cold certainty of the ship above, a purpose as unyielding as the heat death of the universe. He began to move, his aching body a clumsy vessel for his desperate will, stumbling across the vast, continent-sized grave of his god toward the place where the black sliver had landed. A ramp lowered from the lander, meeting the crystalline ground with a soft, magnetic hiss. There was no rush of air, no change in pressure. The environment inside the lander was already a perfect match for the outside, a detail of unnerving preparedness. 5 figures emerged, moving in a tight, diamond formation. They were encased in armor of the same non-color as their ship, a material that seemed to drink the dim red light and give nothing back. Their helmets were smooth, featureless teardrops of opaque black, reflecting nothing. They carried no weapons that Kalen could recognize, only long, slender instruments that hummed with a low, contained energy. They were wardens. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, their steps falling in an unnervingly silent rhythm. They moved not like soldiers, but like surgeons entering a contaminated operating theater. They paid no mind to the glowing, fearful Ethel who watched from the edges of the fungal forests. They were part of the landscape, part of the disease, irrelevant to the objective. Sentinel-1 led the team, his internal heads-up display a cool, blue stream of data overlaying the dim, alien world. He registered the natives as Class 3 bioluminescent psionics, non-hostile. His orders were clear: ignore them unless they interfered with the primary objective. Interference was to be met with non-lethal containment. His gaze was fixed on a point several hundred meters ahead, a deep fissure in the crawler's shell that glowed with a faint, residual energy. His suit's deep-range scanners had already mapped the path to the Heartwood. The schematics were disturbingly familiar, aligning with archival data from the Erebus anomaly. Another world that had required cleansing. The pattern was always the same. The bloom appeared, a system was consumed, and a biological keystone like this crawler was pushed to the brink. The final scream of these keystones, the resonant collapse, was not a cry for help. It was the final sequence of a lock, a psychic tumbler falling into place, a key turning. Their job was to get to the lock before the door could open. Aboard the Stillness, Captain Rostova monitored Sentinel-1's progress through his optical feed. The image was sterile, filtered through a dozen layers of threat analysis and environmental dampening. To her, Kairos was not a world, but a dataset. Energy levels at the core are rising. Jian reported from his station, his voice calm and even. The collapse seems to have initiated a feedback loop. The heartwood is ripening. Rostova's jaw tightened. Ripening, a quaint term for a reality bomb priming itself. She looked at the archival data scrolling on a secondary screen. Texts from the first warden, 1,000 years old. They spoke of the Chimera, the entity the bloom was designed to release. It wasn't a creature of flesh or energy. It was a conceptual plague, a being made of paradox that could rewrite the fundamental laws of physics in its own image. Humanity had met it once, long ago, when they were a young, arrogant species first tapping into the secrets of the universe. They had mistaken its prison for a power source. The war that followed had not been fought with ships and weapons, but with reality itself. Entire star systems were erased, not by explosions, but by being logically disproven. Their histories rewritten until they had never existed at all. Humanity had only survived by becoming what it was now, a species of janitors, of wardens, dedicated to ensuring those doors, those heartwoods, remained locked. They had culled their own capacity for wonder, burned their own mystics, and encased their own minds in logic and discipline to become the perfect, unfeeling antibodies against a conceptual infection. They see us as monsters, Jian said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. Rostova didn't turn. A surgeon is a monster to the tumor. It is a matter of perspective, and our perspective is the only one that ensures there is a universe left to have a perspective in. Keep the null field at maximum. I don't want a single stray thought getting in or out of the system. The scream of Kairos had been loud. Others, less disciplined species, might have heard it. The wardens had to be finished here before any curious saviors could arrive and complicate the surgery. Kalen reached the edge of the fissure just as the 5 wardens arrived. The air around the chasm hummed, tasting of ozone and grief. This was a sacred place, the entry to the mind of Ancestor, a path only weavers were meant to walk. To see these silent, black forms preparing to descend was a sacrilege his soul could not bear. He stepped forward, his dim light a pathetic mote against their absolute darkness. He gathered what was left of his mind, the shattered mirror of his own thoughts and the raging ghost of ancestors, and he focused it into a single, desperate projection. It was not a plea. It was a memory. He hurled the feeling of the sun on Ancestor's back, the taste of spores on the wind, the sound of the world's song, the love of 1 billion years of symbiosis, directly at the mind of the lead warden. He was trying to show them what they were destroying, to make them understand that this was a life, not a contamination. For a microsecond, Sentinel-1's display flickered. A wave of unexpected sensory data, illogical and overwhelming, washed against his suit's psychic dampeners. Red light that felt warm. Wind that tasted of life. A feeling of love so vast it was like drowning in a star. Contamination breach. His suit's AI warned, its voice a calm female monotone in his ear. Psionic entity attempting cognitive infiltration. He saw the native then, a small, shimmering creature standing before them, its body pulsing with a weak, erratic light. It was the source. His protocols were immediate. He raised his left hand, and one of the slender instruments on his back detached and floated forward, its tip glowing with a cold, blue light. It wasn't a weapon. It was a calibrator. It was designed to sever and contain psychic phenomena. Kalen felt a coldness worse than the bloom's touch descend upon him. It was a surgical severing, a precise cut through the fabric of his mind. The ghost of ancestor shrieked and recoiled, the connection snapping. His own thoughts were walled off, free, packed in ice. He was still conscious, but his ability to project, to connect, to be part of the ethel's shared mind was gone. He was isolated, a silent prisoner in his own skull. The warden did not even look at him as he collapsed. His light finally extinguished into a dull, chalky white. The figure simply turned and, without breaking stride, rappelled down into the glowing fissure, followed by the rest of its silent, methodical team. As Kalen lay paralyzed in the encroaching dark, his last coherent thought was one of pure, unadulterated terror. He had failed. The surgeons were inside the heart of his god, and he had just learned that their cure was indistinguishable from death itself. The descent into Ancestor's Heartwood was a journey through a dying mind. The fissure widened into a vast, crystalline cavern, a geode the size of a city, where the inner light of the crawler was fading in slow, mournful pulses. Great crystalline structures, the solidified memories of the creature, hung from the ceiling like chandeliers, each one resonating with a faint, psychic echo. To the wardens, it was a hazardous environment. Their suit AIs worked constantly, filtering the waves of residual emotion and fragmented sensory data that washed over them. The air was thick with the psychic pheromones of grief, a phenomenon their archives classified as a post-mortem resonance cascade. It was like walking through the memory of a scream. Sentinel-1 took point, his calibrator sweeping the area, neutralizing the more potent pockets of raw emotion that could interfere with their equipment. The other 4 wardens moved in his wake, setting up a perimeter. 2 of them deployed resonance sinks, large, tripod-like devices that unfolded and began to hum, drawing the ambient psychic energy into their containment cores, slowly sterilizing the very atmosphere of its sorrow. The silence they brought with them was an active, invasive force, erasing the last vestiges of Ancestor's spirit. They reached the core in less than an hour. It was a sphere of flawless, interwoven crystal, suspended in the center of the cavern by shimmering threads of light. It was the Heartwood, and it was pulsing with a feverish, unhealthy rhythm. Cracks of dark, silent energy, the signature of the bloom, were spreading across its surface like veins of black ice. At its center, a single, infinitesimal point of non-existence was forming a conceptual singularity. The chimera was beginning to breach its cage. "The core is compromised," Sentinel-1 reported, his voice flat and devoid of urgency. "Bloom corruption is at 73%. The final sequence has been initiated. Estimated time to full reality breach 17 minutes. Aboard the Stillness, Rostova watched the timer appear on her main screen. 17 minutes. It was more than enough time. Sentinel-1, you're authorized to proceed with Protocol 0. Deploy the erasure charge. No delays. Acknowledged. Warden Captain, Sentinel-1 replied. He signaled to 2 of his team members, who moved forward carrying a black, metallic cylinder between them. It was a device of last resort, a weapon that did not explode, but deleted. It didn't destroy matter, it unwrote its right to exist, collapsing its quantum waveform into a state of absolute null. It was the only surefire way to sterilize a conceptual plague. They began to set the charge at the base of the heartwood, their movements efficient and practiced. This was a procedure they had drilled 1,000 times in simulations. It was clean. It was final. It was their purpose. On the surface, Lyra and the other Ethel watched the fissure, their collective mind a turmoil of fear and hope. Kalen lay where he had fallen, a dead spot in their consciousness, a silent testament to the newcomer's power. The Weavers, those who communed with the crawlers, could feel the deep silence spreading from below, the psychic equivalent of an anesthetic numbing the very soul of their world. A young Weaver, desperate for answers, tried to reach out with his mind, to brush against the thoughts of the other, smaller crawlers that still roamed the planet. He wanted to ask them what they felt, what they remembered of the Wardens. He touched the mind of the crawler nearest the coast, a creature called the Tidewalker, and what he found shattered his hope. The Tidewalker's mind was not calm. It was thrashing in a silent, primal panic, buried deep within its ancestral memory. Deeper than any Weaver had ever dared to look was a scar. It was a memory not of the crawler's own life, but an inherited trauma, a psychic gene passed down through the silicon lattice. It was a memory of a time, countless eons ago, when other black ships had filled the sky. A memory of other crawlers, their inner lights extinguished not by disease, but by a cold, deliberate fire from the heavens. A memory of Wardens. The young Weaver recoiled, his own light flaring in terror as he broadcast the discovery to the others. They were not here to cure the disease. They were here to kill the patient. They had done it before. The realization spread through the Ethel like a shockwave. The silence was not a cure. It was a prelude to extinction. Lyra looked from the silent form of Kalen to the dark fissure, and a new, unfamiliar emotion began to glow within her rage. The passive acceptance that had defined her people for 1,000,000 years was burning away, replaced by the desperate fire of a cornered animal. They had been lied to. They had been pacified. And now they were being erased. Down in the core chamber, the erasure charge was armed. Sentinel-1 stood before the control interface, his finger hovering over the activation stud. "Charge is primed," he reported. "Awaiting your final command, Warden Captain." The timer on Rostova's screen showed 3 minutes remaining. Everything was proceeding according to protocol. But then, a new alert flashed on her console. A proximity warning. "Captain," Jian said, his voice laced with a sliver of surprise for the first time. "Another vessel has just translated from subspace. It's not one of ours." Rostova's head snapped towards the tactical display. A new icon had appeared at the edge of the system, a jagged, asymmetrical shape that pulsed with chaotic energy signatures. It wasn't Coalition. It wasn't any known galactic power. It was a ghost, a ship out of a pirate legend. "Identify," she commanded. Her voice, sharp as glass. The ship's transponder was broadcasting on an archaic, encrypted frequency, but the stillness's AI broke it in seconds. The name that appeared on the screen made Rostova's blood run cold. The Reckoning. It was a scrapper vessel, a ship crewed by the descendants of the exiled, those who had fled or been cast out of Warden society generations ago for refusing to surrender their emotions, their individuality, their humanity. They were scavengers and heretics who lived in the cracks of the galaxy, trading in forbidden technology and forgotten histories. And their captain was a name she knew from her own past, a ghost she had thought long buried. It's him, she breathed. It's Silas. On the bridge of the reckoning, a grizzled man with a cybernetic eye and a smile that was all sharp edges watched the black crescent of the warden ship on his main viewer. Well, well, Silas Kane drawled, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Look what we have here. A murder of crows, all dressed up for a funeral. His crew, a motley collection of augmented humans, aliens, and rogue AIs, laughed. They had picked up the psychic scream of Kairos 2 systems away. To them, it wasn't a contamination warning. It was a dinner bell. A resonant collapse meant a dying world, and a dying world meant salvage, forgotten tech, and, if they were lucky, a heartwood. A heartwood crystal, with its ability to store and manipulate reality on a quantum level, was the single most valuable object in the known universe. And it looked like the Wardens had gotten here first. They've got the system locked down in a null field, Captain. His navigator, a four-armed Cathar named Grix, reported. We can't get a clear scan of the surface. Silas leaned back in his command chair, stroking the scarred plating of his jaw. Don't need a scan. I know what they're doing. They're not here to save anyone. They're here to bury the evidence. He had been a warden once, a long time ago, before he saw what Protocol Zero really meant. He had seen them erase a world of 20 billion people to keep one of these gates from opening. He had refused his orders, and they had tried to erase him. 2. He'd been running, fighting, and being a thorn in their side ever since. The null field is a cage, not a shield, Silas said, a predatory glint in his organic eye. It's designed to keep things in. It'll be weaker from the inside out. Get me a channel to the warden ship. Let's see if old Eva remembers me. The attempt to hail the stillness was met with a wall of electronic silence. No response, Captain, Grix said. Silas grinned. Didn't think so. She was never the chatty type. All right, new plan. They want to sterilize the planet. Let's give them a little contamination they can't handle. Launch the swarm. Aim for the lander on the surface. Let's get their attention. A hatch opened on the underbelly of the reckoning, and a cloud of 1,000,000 tiny and young insect-like drones poured out, their composite wings catching the dim red starlight. They were not weapons of destruction. They were weapons of information. They were mimetic infiltrators, designed to bypass electronic security and flood systems with junk data, viral ideas, and pure, unadulterated chaos. They streaked towards Kairos, a river of anarchic code aimed at the heart of the warden's sterile, orderly operation. On the surface, Lyra had rallied the Ethel. Her soft, emerald glow had become a burning, defiant green. They couldn't fight the warden's technology, but they were not helpless. They were a part of Kairos. The planet was their ally. Following her lead, they began to merge their consciousness, not with the crawlers, but with the planet itself. They sank their thoughts into the mycelial networks that webbed the entire globe, into the roots of the phosphorescent forests, into the very stone and soil. The planet began to respond. The ground around the warden's lander began to tremble. Crystalline flora, dormant for centuries, burst from the ground, their sharp, razor-edged leaves weaving into a thorny, impenetrable barricade around the black ship. The very air began to change, the spores thickening, becoming corrosive, eating away at the lander's outer hull. It was a slow, geological assault, the planet itself trying to digest the foreign body on its skin. Down below, just as Sentinel-1 was about to receive the final command, his suit's AI screamed a warning. Incoming data swarm. Mimetic payload detected. External communications compromised. His connection to the stillness dissolved into a screech of static. At the same time, the cavern began to shake violently, dust and small crystals raining down from the ceiling. Surface team reports environmental hostilities from the native life forms. One of the other wardens reported over their local comms. The planet itself is attacking the lander. Sentinel-1 felt a flicker of something his training had conditioned him to suppress uncertainty. The natives were fighting back. An external force was interfering. The clean, surgical procedure was becoming a messy, complicated brawl. And the heartwood in front of him was pulsing faster and faster, the black cracks of the bloom spreading, the point of nothingness at its center beginning to open. He had a choice: follow his last order and activate the charge, hoping it would solve everything, or try to understand the new variables that were suddenly in play. Wardens did not improvise. They followed protocol. His finger moved decisively towards the stud, but before he could press it, a voice crackled through his helmet, bypassing his scrambled comms, a voice that was both broadcast and a thought pushed directly into his mind. "Hold it right there, Tin Soldier. You push that button, and you're not just wiping the planet. You're ringing the dinner bell for the thing you're so scared of." Sentinel-1 froze. He spun around, weapon that was not a weapon raised. But the cavern was empty. The voice was everywhere and nowhere. "Who is this?" he demanded. The voice chuckled, a sound full of static and rebellion. "Just an old friend of your boss. Tell me, are your orders to prevent the Chimera from getting out, or are they to make sure no one else learns how to control it?" The question hit Sentinel-1 like a physical blow. It was heresy. It was a thought so far outside his operational parameters that his mind struggled to even process it. Control it. The Chimera was a fundamental force of universal destruction. You didn't control it. You ran from it. You erased it. You prayed it never, ever noticed you. "Don't you see?" The voice of Silas Kane echoed through the chamber as his data swarm finally cracked the warden's local network. "The bloom isn't a key to open a cage. It's a tool to tune an engine. And you've just spent the last 1,000 years keeping the schematics all to yourselves." The accusation hung in the resonating cavern. A mimetic virus far more potent than the data swarm now tearing through the warden systems. Sentinel-1 stood frozen, Silas's words echoing in the disciplined emptiness of his mind. Control it. The concept was a logical fallacy, a paradox. His entire existence, the entire creed of the Warden Order, was built on the axiom that the Chimera was an apocalyptic, uncontrollable force. To suggest otherwise was like suggesting one could negotiate with a supernova. His objective is to sow doubt. His suit AI advised, its voice a calm anchor in the sea of chaos. Cognitive dissonance is a recognized tactic of Scrapper-class hostiles. Recommend adherence to Protocol 0. But for the first time in his service, the protocol felt incomplete. The natives were fighting back with a planetary intelligence he hadn't anticipated. An external, technologically sophisticated enemy was now in play. His comms to the stillness were a wall of screaming static. He was blind, deaf, and alone. And the heartwood. The heartwood was changing. The pulses were slowing, the frantic rhythm giving way to something more deliberate, more controlled. The black cracks of the bloom were no longer spreading erratically. They were forming a pattern, a circuit, a latticework of impossible geometry that was converging on the singularity at its core. The bloom wasn't breaking its prison. It was building a lens. Aboard the stillness, Rostova watched in horror as Silas's data swarm bypassed her ship's outer defenses and slammed into their primary systems. It wasn't a brute force attack, it was a seduction. The swarm was composed of fragmented truths, whispers of Warden history that had been redacted and buried for centuries. It showed records of the first Warden, not as a savior, but as a scientist who had tried to harness the Chimera. It displayed schematics of the erasure charge, revealing its secondary function not just to delete the heartwood, but to absorb its resonant frequency, storing the key in the Warden archives. "They're not destroying the keys," Gian breathed, his disciplined facade cracking as he watched the forbidden data scroll across his own console. "They're collecting them." Rostova slammed her fist on the console, shutting down the feed. It's propaganda lies designed to break our morale, but the seed of doubt was planted. She had always wondered why Protocol Zero required them to bring the resonant signature of the core back. They had been told it was for analysis, to better understand the enemy. But what if it was to build a master key, Captain? The comms officer reported, his voice tight with panic. "I've lost contact with Sentinel-1 and the scrapper ship. It's launching drop pods. They're heading for the surface, directly for the fissure." Rostova's face was a mask of cold fury. Silas wasn't just trying to stop her. He was trying to steal the prize. "Jane, get our systems firewalled. Scour this data virus from the ship. And get me a weapon lock on that scrapper vessel. If he wants a war, he'll get one." But even as she gave the order, she knew it was too late. The fight was no longer in orbit. It was on the planet. It was in the heart of the dying god. Silas Kane's drop pod was a brutal piece of engineering, an armored coffin designed for one purpose, to get through a hot zone in one piece. It slammed into the crystalline surface of Ancestor with the force of a meteor, cracking the shell for 100 meters in every direction. The hatch blew, and Silas stepped out, a heavy, custom-built rail rifle in his hands, his cybernetic eye glowing a predatory crimson. His crew, a dozen hardened scrappers in patched-together, heavily modified armor, fanned out behind him, their weapons covering all angles. They saw the Ethel's planetary defenses, the thorny barricades and corrosive spores, but they paid them no mind. They weren't here to fight the planet. They were here for the main event. "Griggs, you're on Overwatch." Silas barked into his comm. "Anything bigger than a rock moves down there. You turn it to glass. Everyone else, with me. Let's not keep the men in black waiting." They moved with the confident swagger of wolves entering a sheep pen, rappelling into the same fissure the Wardens had used. They were loud, chaotic, and utterly alive, a stark contrast to the silent, methodical specters they were chasing. The arrival of the scrappers turned the core chamber into a three-way standoff. Sentinel-1 and his 4 Wardens, their formation broken, now stood back to back, a tight circle of black armor and contained energy. Silas and his crew took up positions at the entrance to the cavern, using the crystalline pillars as cover. And, in the middle, The heartwood pulsed, its transformation nearly complete. The singularity at its core was no longer a point of nothingness. It was a perfect, shimmering sphere of mirrored reality, an eye-opening for the first time. "Eva send you to do her dirty work." Sentinel Silas's voice boomed through the cavern, amplified by his helmet's external speakers. "Still cleaning up the messes the grown-ups made." "I see." Sentinel-1 did not reply. His mind was racing, trying to reconcile his mission parameters with the impossible situation before him. His duty was to prevent the breach, but the scrapper's words had infected his logic. If the order was collecting the keys, then his duty was not to destroy the threat, but to secure an asset. The erasure charge was no longer a tool of sterilization. It was a capture device, and these scrappers were trying to steal it. "You are interfering with a Class 0 quarantine," Sentinel-1 finally said, his voice a cold, synthesized monotone. "Surrender your weapons and prepare to be sanitized." Silas let out a harsh laugh. "Sanitized? Is that what you call it? Now I call it getting murdered." "No thanks. We're here to offer these poor folk a third option. One that doesn't involve getting wiped from existence or becoming a lab rat for your spooky bosses." He gestured with his rifle towards the heartwood. "That thing isn't a bomb. It's an amplifier, a gateway." The bloom was just the dialing sequence. The Ethel's little psychic scream was the last number. And now, the line is open. The question is, who is going to answer the call? On the surface, Lyra felt the new arrivals. They were different from the wardens. Their minds were not shielded voids, but roaring fires of emotion, greed, anger, excitement, loyalty. They were chaotic, but they were understandable, and their arrival had thrown the warden's plans into disarray. She felt the conflict below, a clash of two opposing silences, and in that moment of hesitation, she saw her people's only chance. She turned her focus away from the planet's defenses and towards Kalen. He lay insensate, his mind severed by the warden's calibrator, but he was not dead. The ghost of ancestor was gone, but the knowledge, the memories he had absorbed during the collapse, were still there, locked away in the shattered prison of his mind. He was a living library, a copy of the Heartwood's data. That was why the wardens had neutralized him. He was a witness. He was a backup. Lyra gathered the remaining weavers. "We cannot fight their machines," she projected, her thoughts sharp and clear. "But Kalen holds the memory of the song. We must awaken him. We must make him sing again." They formed a circle around Kalen's still form. They poured their combined will, their shared life force, into him. It was the reverse of what they had done with Ancestor. They were not focusing a mind to be broadcast. They were trying to rebuild one from the echoes of their own. His chalkier white form began to flicker with a faint emerald light, a reflection of their own hope. The standoff below was broken by the Heartwood itself, with a final deep chime that resonated in both sound and thought. The transformation was complete. The eye at its center opened. It did not reveal a monster or a gateway to another dimension. It revealed a reflection, a perfect, flawless mirror of the cavern, of the wardens, of the scrappers. But the reflections were not perfect copies. The reflected Sentinel-1 stood not with a calibrator, but with an open, beckoning hand. The reflected Silas Kane held not a rifle, but a single, glowing spore. "Or what is this?" one of the scrappers muttered, unnerved. "It's a choice," Silas whispered, his bravado gone, replaced by a sense of awe. It's asking us what we want it to be. A weapon, a tool, a god. It becomes what the observer brings to it. He understood now. The chimera wasn't a creature. It was a potentiality, a quantum state of pure creation that collapsed into a reality based on the consciousness that first observed it. The Wardens, with their fear and their need for control, would have collapsed it into a weapon of ultimate destruction, a self-fulfilling prophecy of the apocalypse they so dreaded. They weren't preventing a monster from being born. Their very presence was what would create it. Sentinel-1 saw it too. His suit's AI was screaming, classifying the phenomenon as a reality state paradox and recommending immediate activation of the erasure charge. But he hesitated. He looked at his own reflection in the Heartwood's eye, at the open, peaceful hand, and, for the first time, he felt the crushing weight of his Order's fear. They had spent a millennium fighting a monster of their own making. Suddenly, a new voice entered the cavern. It was not broadcast. It was not psychic. It was a song, a low, mournful, and yet incredibly powerful hum that seemed to emanate from the very crystals of the cave. It was a song of 1 billion years of twilight, of symbiosis, of a life lived in quiet harmony. On the surface, Kalen was stirring. The combined will of the Weavers had broken the Warden's psychic prison. His light returned, not the wounded silver of before, but a deep, resonant emerald green, infused with the strength of his people. And he was projecting, not a scream of agony, but the pure, unfiltered memory of ancestor. He was showing the Heartwood what Kairos was, what its life had been. He was giving it another choice. The eye in the Heartwood shifted. The reflections of the Wardens and the Scrappers faded, replaced by a swirling vortex of blue and green light. The colors of the Ethel. The song intensified, and the very air in the cavern began to glow. Silas lowered his rifle. Sentinel-1 slowly, deliberately, took his finger off the activation stud of the erasure charge. They were no longer the observers. They were no longer the ones defining the outcome. The planet itself, through its chosen weaver, was now in control. The chimera was about to be born, and it would be born in the image of Kairos. The song of Kalen was the final key. It was not a plea for mercy or a cry of defiance. It was a statement of pure existence. It poured into the Heartwood, a torrent of 1 billion years of life, overriding the fear of the Wardens and the greed of the Scrappers with a simple, undeniable truth: we are here. The eye in the center of the crystal sphere ceased to be a mirror. It became a womb. The light within swelled, a soft vital green and blue, and the entire cavern, the very substance of the dead god ancestor, began to dissolve not into dust, but into light. Sentinel-1 watched, his weapon lowered, his programming screaming at him to fire the erasure charge, to stop the breach, to follow protocol. But his training had no context for a breach that felt like a sunrise. Silas and his crew backed away, their bravado finally cracking, replaced by a primal awe. They were treasure hunters who had stumbled into the presence of a genuine god being born, and their guns and their cynicism felt like children's toys. The Heartwood did not explode. It unfolded. The light poured out, not as a destructive wave, but as a gentle tide. It washed over the crystalline walls, which resonated and began to glow in sympathy. It flowed up the fissure to the surface, where the Ethel watched, transfixed, as the light touched the dormant body of Ancestor. The vast, continent-sized shell began to hum, not with the slow, geological rumble of before, but with a new, vibrant energy. Fissures of light spread across its surface, not cracks of damage, but the pathways of a new consciousness. The planet Kairos was not just hosting life anymore. The planet was the life, the ethel, the crawlers, the mycelial networks. The very stone and air were being woven together into a single, unified, planetary consciousness. The Kairos mind had awakened, down in the core chamber, which was now a sunlit grotto of living light. The new consciousness turned its attention to the intruders. There was no anger, no judgment. There was only a profound, ancient, and slightly curious awareness. It did not speak in words, but in direct, untranslatable understanding poured straight into their minds. It showed Silas a vision of himself, old and alone on a throne of scavenged treasures. The last free man in an empty universe he had helped plunder into oblivion. It showed Sentinel-1 a vision of the Warden Order 1,000 years hence, still standing guard in silent, black ships over long-dead galaxies, their purpose forgotten, their fear the only thing they had left. It showed them the end point of their chosen paths, the logical conclusion of their beliefs, laid bare and stripped of all self-deception. Then, it gave them a choice, a feeling, not a command. You are a discord in the song. You may leave, and the song will forget you. Or you may stay, and learn to sing in harmony. Silas Kane, the ultimate individualist, the man who had built his identity on rebellion and the rejection of all authority, recoiled from the thought of being absorbed into a collective. "I'm no one's choir boy," he snarled, more to himself than to the being of light. He motioned to his crew, who needed no encouragement. They scrambled for their ropes, retreating from this unnerving, gentle apocalypse as fast as they could. Their greed had been replaced by a more fundamental instinct, the fear of being understood. The 4 other wardens, their discipline shattered, followed suit. Their protocols had been rendered meaningless, and without their orders, they were lost. They retreated, their mission a catastrophic failure. But Sentinel-1 did not move. He stood looking at the vision the Kairos mind had shown him, the endless, sterile, pointless vigil, and he saw not a noble duty, but an eternal prison. He had been a perfect warden, a being of pure logic and obedience. But Silas's heretical question and Kalen's impossible song had created a fracture in the perfect vessel of his mind. And now, the light of Kairos was pouring in, slowly, with a motion that felt more significant than any act of war he had ever committed. He reached up and unsealed his helmet. The face revealed was pale and young, with eyes that had never been allowed to show emotion. He let the helmet fall to the crystal floor with a soft clatter. He looked at the heart of the light, at the consciousness of the world, and for the first time in his life, he made a choice that was entirely his own. He would stay. Aboard the stillness, Rostova saw it all. The energy signature from the planet had stabilized into something she could not classify, something that was both biological and technological, both chaotic and perfectly ordered. She saw the scrappers and 4 of her 5 wardens fleeing the planet in a panic. She saw Sentinel-1, her finest soldier, abandon his post, remove his helmet, and surrender. The contamination was absolute. Her mission had not just failed, it had been inverted. The secret of the Heartwood was not only out, It had been activated in a way the Warden archives had never even conceived. All that was left was the final protocol, the one reserved for when the lie could no longer be contained. Tier 0, Planetary Erasure. "Bring the main weapon online," she commanded, her voice a shard of ice. "Target the planet's core. We will burn this entire system from the star charts." Jian looked at her, his face pale. "Captain, we don't know what that energy is. Firing on it could have unforeseen consequences. The unforeseen is what we exist to prevent." Rostova snapped back, her eyes fixed on the targeting reticle that was now centered on the nascent god below. "The greatest unforeseen is that this heresy is allowed to spread. Fire." The forward spire of the stillness split open, revealing the lens of the erasure lance. A wave of pure, weaponized null energy began to gather, a beam of absolute nothingness that would unwrite Kairos from the fabric of space-time. But as the weapon reached peak charge, the Kairos mind acted. It did not raise a shield or fire a counter-salvo. It reached out with its consciousness, spanning the void in an instant. It touched the mind of Eva Rostova. It did not attack her. It gave her a gift. It gave her the one thing the Warden Order had forbidden for 1,000 years, the truth. It showed her the first Warden, not as a grim protector, but as a terrified scientist who had accidentally touched the Chimera and, in his fear, had collapsed its infinite potential into a monster. It showed her how the Order had been founded on that single, terrified lie. A lie that had cascaded down through the centuries, demanding ever greater sacrifices, ever more brutal cleansings, to protect a phantom of their own creation. She saw her life, her duty, her sacrifices, not as a noble defense of reality, but as the tireless reinforcement of a cage built around nothing. For a single, silent moment, Eva Rostova understood. The clarity was both beautiful and agonizing. She could end it. She could stop the lance, accept the new reality, and let the universe change. But a lifetime of conditioning, 1,000 years of doctrine, was a prison stronger than any steel. To accept the truth would be to accept that her entire life had been a monstrous mistake. And that she could not do. Her finger, trembling, jabbed the firing stud. The erasure lance fired, and the Kairos mind, having offered truth and been met with denial, delivered its consequence. The beam of nothingness left the stillness and streaked toward the planet, but it never arrived. A few thousand kilometers from the surface, it simply stopped. The beam unraveled, its focused negation dissolving into a harmless, glittering cloud of inert particles. Then, the cloud flowed back towards the ship, not as an attack, but as a transformation. The stillness did not explode. It changed. The black, light-absorbing hull blossomed with phosphorescent, crystalline flora. The erasure lance became a spire of inert, beautiful crystal. The null field generator sputtered and died, and the cold, sterile silence of the ship was replaced by the faint, gentle hum of the Song of Kairos. Rostova stood on her now powerless bridge, a queen of a dead kingdom, forever adrift in a silent, beautiful tomb of her own making, left with nothing but the truth she had refused. On the surface of the now fully awakened Kairos, the dim red sun began to rise. Kalen and Lyra stood together on the back of the living ancestor, their light, and the light of all Ethel, now part of the greater glow of the world itself. With them stood a quiet, bare-faced man who was just beginning to learn the words to a song 1 billion years old. The scream had been answered. The silence had been broken. And across the galaxy, on 100 forgotten worlds where other heartwoods lay buried, a soft, resonant hum began. A single, harmonious note spreading through the void. The Wardens had tried to be the universe's janitors, but they had only succeeded in waking the ghosts from every machine. The age of fear was over. The universe was beginning to